Mark Sheldon had never thought of himself as a man who would end up defending land boundaries as if they were matters of life and death. He had inherited the old glass recycling factory from his father, a practical man who had spent his entire life turning broken bottles and discarded paints into usable raw material. The factory stood on the edge of a town that had grown unevenly around it, with industrial zones and quiet residential streets overlapping in awkward ways. To Mark, the factory was more than just a business. It was a reminder of his family's persistence, of the nights when his father stayed late at the furnaces, of the way the heavy scent of scorched sand and heated minerals seemed woven into the very walls. When his father died, Mark invested his savings and years of work into modernizing the production, adding new furnaces, better machinery, and gradually buying back adjacent lots that had been abandoned when the old industrial corridor fell into decline. His plan was to create something stable and lasting, a business that could resist the endless cycles of economic turbulence. By the time he reached his 40s, he felt he had done it. The factory produced steadily, the workers respected him, and although the neighborhood around them often felt like it was decaying, he had carved out a stronghold of reliability. That was why the new activity on the neighboring property unsettled him so deeply. At first, it was only a minor curiosity. A man he did not know, Jason Harvey, had bought the residential house that bordered the backside of Mark's land. The house had been empty for years, a 2-story structure with faded paint, leaning fences, and an overgrown yard. Mark had occasionally thought of making an offer on it himself, but the price had been too high for a building in such poor condition, and he did not see the urgency. When Jason moved in, Mark assumed he was just another homeowner, someone who wanted a quiet corner near town. But soon, activity began that did not look like ordinary repairs. Wooden stakes appeared at the edge of Mark's warehouse, aligned in straight rows that seemed less like landscaping and more like boundary lines. Piles of gravel were dropped by trucks, and workers began digging trenches in ground that Mark knew was his. At first, he laughed it off as a mistake, thinking Jason's contractors had misread a plan or misunderstood instructions. But when he walked around the property one afternoon and saw that the stakes practically touched the foundation of his factory wall, the smile faded. This was not a misunderstanding. Someone was preparing to fence off part of his land. The confrontation was oddly calm at first. Mark introduced himself, extended his hand, and explained that there might be some confusion because the trench clearly cut into the factory lot. Jason, a man with a neat beard and carefully pressed clothes, did not seem defensive or embarrassed. He looked Mark straight in the eye, nodded, and said, "I appreciate your concern, but I have had my engineer check everything. The plan is correct. This boundary has been in place for decades." There was no anger in his tone, no bluster, only a quiet certainty that made Mark uneasy. He tried to protest, explaining that his deed and his survey showed otherwise, but Jason simply repeated that the land was his and that the fence was only the beginning. The calmness was more disturbing than if the man had shouted. Mark walked back to his factory with the strange sensation that he was being drawn into a conflict already decided in someone else's favor. That evening, he dug out the old maps his father had kept in a steel cabinet. The factory's boundaries had always been clear. The property stretched exactly to the row of birches at the edge of the yard. But the maps revealed something else, something that made his stomach tighten. The residential house that Jason now occupied did not appear on the earliest plans. Even on later maps there were inconsistencies, as if the structure had slipped into place without full approval, half acknowledged and half ignored. Mark stared at the papers long into the night, realizing that his battle would not be about a misplaced fence. It would be about whether his family's factory, the work of 2 generations, had ever been safe at all. The following week unfolded with a heaviness that Mark had not felt in years, a sense that the world he had always considered solid and defined was beginning to tilt under his feet. After his first conversation with Jason, he tried to dismiss the whole incident as some overzealous miscalculation, but each day the evidence mounted that this was no accident. By Monday morning, when Mark drove into the factory yard, he saw that a delivery truck had dropped off bundles of steel fencing, and men in hard hats were unloading them onto the strip of ground that cut into his own property. They worked with a confidence that suggested they believed themselves to be in the right, as if the factory wall looming only a few feet away was irrelevant. Mark called out to them, but they ignored him, gesturing toward Jason, who stood a little distance away, clipboard in hand, as though he were supervising a legitimate construction site. The sight triggered something in Mark, not just anger but a deeper dread, because it reminded him of the way bureaucracies moved, cold, steady, certain, indifferent to any personal protest. That night, Mark called a surveyor he trusted, a man who had helped him with the purchase of the adjoining lot years ago. The surveyor, named Leonard, agreed to come out the next morning and run a quick assessment. When Leonard arrived with his tripod and instruments, he seemed confident it would be a simple matter. But within an hour, his expression changed from casual assurance to frustration. The coordinates on his device did not align with the official city data. They wavered, jumped, and at one point contradicted themselves. Leonard muttered that either someone had tampered with the local reference points or the city's database had been altered. He promised to dig deeper but admitted that the inconsistency would complicate things if the issue went before a commission. Mark felt the first tremor of real fear, because if a survey could not pin down something as basic as the boundary, Jason might already have the upper hand. Determined to get clarity, Mark drove to the county land records office. He expected a tedious wait and some dusty files, but what he found unsettled him far more. The clerk pulled the property records and presented him with a stack of papers. Among them was a redevelopment plan from 5 years ago that showed the industrial zone marked for demolition and replacement with a mixed-use green corridor. On the plan, his factory lot was highlighted as a transitional area slated for long-term. Repurposing Jason's lot, however, appeared as a blank space with no clear definition, as if the house did not officially exist. When Mark asked about the discrepancy, the clerk gave a polite but evasive smile and said, "Sometimes these plans don't get updated properly." She tried to move on to the next customer, but Mark pressed, demanding to know how a house that clearly stood for decades could be absent from the records. Finally, the clerk leaned closer and whispered that if he wanted more than surface answers, he should look at the zoning archives from the late 70s. Her tone carried a weight that made Mark pause. He requested the older files and waited in the dim records room while the archivist shuffled through drawers. The documents he received were grainy photocopies, but what struck him was the notation scrawled across one of the maps. Temporary residential structure, not approved for permanent registry. The phrase hit him like a blow. Jason's house had never been meant to stand as a legal, permanent residence. At best, it was tolerated. At worst, it was a ghost structure, a building that slipped between the cracks of bureaucracy and survived only because no one pushed too hard. Mark left the office shaken, the papers folded under his arm like fragile evidence of a crime no one cared to prosecute. That evening, he returned to confront Jason again. The air smelled of fresh cement, and a line of concrete footings now ran along the disputed strip, cutting so close to the warehouse wall that Mark could feel the vibration of the drills inside his office. Jason greeted him with the same unbothered calm as before. Mark laid the old documents on a workbench between them, demanding an explanation. Jason did not even look at them. He simply said, "Those papers don't matter anymore. The city updated the boundaries last year. You should have kept up with the process." When Mark asked to see the supposed updated documents, Jason smiled thinly and said, "You'll see them soon enough." The next morning, an envelope appeared taped to the factory gate. It was not mailed, not official, just left there like a warning. Inside was a letter with a municipal header that looked authentic at first glance, but the font was subtly off, the seal slightly smudged. The letter declared that Mark's property was under review for boundary irregularities, and that until the review was completed, no expansion or development could be undertaken. Mark's hands trembled as he read it. He knew enough about official paperwork to recognize the errors, but he also knew that if such a document circulated, even as a forgery, it could paralyze his operations. Banks might hesitate to finance repairs, clients might worry about the stability of contracts, and inspectors might suddenly show up unannounced. By Wednesday, the situation escalated further. Jason arranged for a cement truck to pour directly along the disputed line, effectively blocking the factory's rear entrance where shipments usually came and went. Workers arriving for their shift had to squeeze through side gates, and delivery drivers refused to enter until the mess was cleared. When Mark shouted across the yard, Jason only responded, "The entrance is on your land, but the ground beneath it isn't." The sheer audacity left Mark speechless. That evening, he sat alone in the factory office, staring at the framed photograph of his father that hung above the desk. The factory had always been his anchor, the one constant in a changing world. Now it felt as though the ground itself was betraying him, as if the soil beneath the walls was shifting and pulling the building into someone else's grasp. He thought of the old notation on the zoning map, of the house that was never meant to exist, and he realized with a chill that Jason was not just fencing off a strip of land. He was positioning himself to rewrite reality, to turn a tolerated mistake into a permanent advantage. When Leonard called later that night with more troubling news, that several of the city's survey markers had been quietly replaced in the last few months, and no one seemed to know who authorized the changes, Mark felt the last remnants of certainty slip away. He understood that what was happening was bigger than a petty fence dispute. Someone had been preparing this move long before Jason arrived, and he, the supposed owner of his land, was now only a piece to be shifted on someone else's board. The realization hardened into a single, undeniable truth. This was only the beginning, and if he did not act quickly, the factory his family had built would be swallowed whole. Mark rose the next morning with the sensation that the walls of his own factory had grown tighter during the night, as if the building itself were suffocating under invisible pressure, and although he tried to focus on production schedules and payrolls, his mind returned again and again to the strip of land outside where Jason's workers were steadily cementing a line of separation into existence. The situation had already disrupted deliveries, and several clients had called asking why trucks were delayed. He gave excuses about mechanical issues and scheduling errors, but he knew such lies could only hold for so long before doubts spread, and contracts began to dissolve. Determined not to watch his business unravel because of another man's arrogance, Mark called Leonard again, demanding a more definitive survey, and this time the surveyor arrived with heavier equipment, a GPS receiver, and a bundle of historical references. The two men spent hours moving across the property while the factory machines hummed in the background, and Mark watched Leonard grow visibly agitated as the instruments failed to align with each other. At one point, Leonard crouched in the dirt near the disputed line, staring at his readings with disbelief, before standing up and declaring that someone had deliberately shifted or falsified reference data in the city's registry. According to him, it was not just a matter of old coordinates being out of date. There had been intentional tampering, subtle enough to look like clerical error, but effective enough to redraw boundaries in favor of whoever knew how to exploit the change. The revelation struck Mark like a hammer blow, not because it shocked him that someone might cheat, but because it suggested a larger game at play. Jason, with his calm demeanor and smug certainty, was not simply a neighbor clinging to a mistake. He was acting with knowledge that the official maps, if checked, would now appear to support his claim. Mark insisted Leonard prepare a written report, even if incomplete, and promised to pay double for speed. That evening he gathered all the old deeds, the notarized papers his father had kept in a fireproof box, and spread them across his desk like a battlefield map, tracing lines with his finger until his eyes burned. Everything he had always known about the factory's borders was clear in those documents. Yet out in the real world men were digging, pouring, and measuring as if his evidence were nothing but scraps of paper from a bygone era. 2 nights later, when the factory gates were locked and the yard silent, Mark returned to check the perimeter with a flashlight. The beams illuminated new wooden posts driven into the soil, not by his order, and each bore a spray-painted mark, red circles with diagonal lines through them. They resembled survey markers, but rougher, improvised, like someone wanted to create the illusion of authority without the actual credentials. As he bent to examine one of them, he realized with horror that the line of the posts cut directly through the center of his loading dock. He heard a faint rustle behind him, turned quickly, and caught a glimpse of 2 men retreating into the shadows near Jason's house. They did not run, only walked away steadily, leaving him alone under the buzzing beam of his flashlight, and in that moment he understood that this was no longer about paperwork or neighborly disputes. It was about intimidation, about showing him that they could act with impunity. Mark went to the municipal zoning office the next morning to file a formal complaint. The receptionist listened politely, then called a supervisor, a thin man in a gray suit who spoke with a practiced neutrality that infuriated Mark more than open hostility would have. The supervisor glanced at the deeds, nodded, and said the matter was under review. When Mark pressed for a timeline, the man's eyes slid away and he answered that boundary disputes could take months, possibly years, to resolve. Mark demanded to know how construction could continue in the meantime, and the supervisor responded with a phrase that echoed in his head long after: "We cannot interfere with work carried out under provisional allowances." Provisional allowances, Mark realized, were exactly what Jason had been counting on, an interim status that gave him freedom to act while the official verdict remained locked in bureaucratic limbo. The frustration boiled into fury that night when Mark returned to the factory to find a temporary chain-link fence erected across the rear entrance, complete with a padlock. It had been installed while his employees were inside working, and now they had to exit through side doors like intruders. Mark tore at the padlock, shouted curses into the night, and dialed the police. When officers arrived, they inspected the fence, listened to both sides, and finally shrugged, saying it was a civil matter, not criminal trespass, since Jason claimed the land as his. Mark tried to show the officers the deeds, the surveys, but they waved him off, repeating that until a judge ruled otherwise, they would not interfere. Watching their patrol car drive away, Mark felt the crushing loneliness of a man abandoned by the very systems he thought were there to protect him. Days blurred together as Jason's presence grew heavier, not loud or violent, but constant, always one step ahead. Concrete trucks rolled in early in the morning. Men in reflective vests carried clipboards with stamps that looked official, and neighbors began to murmur about the factory owner, who was probably losing land he never rightfully had. Mark heard fragments of gossip in the corner store, saw looks exchanged at the gas station, and realized that Jason's calm certainty had begun to seep into the community, shaping the narrative before Mark could even defend himself. He tried to ignore it, but one evening, while reviewing invoices in his office, he heard the unmistakable sound of hammering just outside his window. He stepped out and saw a crew fastening metal sheets to the new fence line, extending it upward to block any visibility between the factory yard and Jason's property. When he demanded to know who had authorized it, the foreman simply pointed to a folded document with a city header. Mark grabbed it, scanned it, and nearly laughed at the absurdity. The text was riddled with vague phrases like community safety measures and temporary access control. Yet it bore a notary seal that looked disturbingly real. That night, unable to sleep, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the document spread before him, and realized with a cold certainty that Jason was not improvising. Every step had been planned. The shifting of survey markers, the forged-looking letters, the careful timing of construction. It was a slow siege, designed to push him into exhaustion, to make him question his own ground until surrender felt easier than resistance. He clenched his fists, telling himself he would not give in, but in the silence of the night, With the faint metallic echo of hammers drifting across the yard, he understood that the first battle had already been lost. Mark had always believed that persistence was enough to outlast deception, that if he simply held fast to the truth of his documents and the physical evidence of his factory's walls pressing against the disputed ground, the system would eventually recognize what was real. Yet, by the time 3 more weeks passed, the quiet siege had changed both his factory and his mind. Deliveries were rerouted through awkward side paths. Some drivers threatened to cancel contracts altogether, and a group of workers muttered that maybe it was safer to seek employment elsewhere, because no one wanted to wake one morning to find the gates chained shut. Mark reassured them with forced confidence, but he could feel their loyalty fraying, not because they doubted him, but because they feared being trapped in a conflict they did not understand. The weight of responsibility bore down on him like a furnace at full heat, and each night he sat in the darkened office, staring at his father's photograph, feeling the quiet disappointment in those steady eyes. It was Leonard, exhausted from nights of combing through survey data, who gave Mark the first real fracture in Jason's seemingly unbreakable front. The surveyor returned with photocopies of archival zoning maps, some of them nearly illegible, but on one he pointed to a faint notation in faded ink. It referred to a municipal judgment from the early 80s, a ruling that had required a temporary structure, Jason's house or its predecessor, to be moved because it encroached on the industrial buffer zone. The order had never been executed. The house was left standing, perhaps because enforcement funds were lacking, perhaps because no one cared enough to follow through. For decades the oversight had festered, forgotten by everyone except those who knew how to profit from it. Jason's calm confidence made new sense now. He was not fighting to protect his house. He was exploiting a loophole that had existed for 40 years, a loophole so buried under dust and apathy that only someone who had studied the archives with purpose would dare invoke it. Armed with this discovery, Mark contacted a property lawyer, a woman named Claire Donnelly, whose reputation for taking on impossible zoning battles preceded her. She listened with patience as he unfolded the story, his words tumbling over each other in frustration, and when he laid the photocopied maps on her desk, she leaned forward with sharp interest. "If this notation is genuine," she said, "then the house was never fully legalized, which means its claim over your land is not only weak, it's voidable." For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a surge of cautious hope. Claire explained that a court would need to verify the document, and the city would resist reopening an old case, but if they pressed hard enough, the oversight could not simply be erased by new provisional allowances. She warned, however, that Jason's side would not back down easily, because if the house's illegitimacy were exposed, every improvement, every expansion, every ounce of value attached to it would collapse instantly. Encouraged, Mark agreed to initiate proceedings, but before the papers could even be filed, the escalation grew darker. One night, as he left the factory, he noticed strange markings sprayed in chalk along the asphalt near the disputed fence. They resembled geometric diagrams, circles intersected by straight lines with numbers scrawled at intervals. At first he thought it was children playing, but the precision unsettled him. When he bent closer, he saw that the numbers corresponded to measurements he recognized. 30 feet, exactly the distance by which Jason's house had intruded. The realization chilled him. Someone was mapping the encroachment openly, right at his gates, as if mocking him with the accuracy of his own evidence. He cleaned the markings with water the next morning, but 2 nights later they reappeared, drawn again, this time extending onto the factory wall itself. Claire advised him to document everything, to keep photographs and logs because evidence of intimidation could strengthen his case. But Mark hesitated. Each photo he took felt like an admission that the ground under his feet was no longer secure, and he despised the thought of his father's factory reduced to a gallery of vandalism. Instead, he pressed forward with legal filings, submitting the archival maps and requesting a hearing. The court responded with a date 2 months away, which felt like an eternity in the quicksand of Jason's advance, But at least it was movement. When Mark told Leonard, the surveyor only shook his head grimly and said, "2 months is a long time when someone's building in days." As if to prove him right, Jason accelerated construction. Heavy equipment appeared overnight, and by the end of the week, a half-built garage jutted directly against the disputed line. Its foundation poured so close that Mark could feel the tremor in his warehouse wall. When he stormed across to confront Jason, demanding to know how he could build while litigation was pending, Jason simply folded his arms and replied, "I'm improving my property. Nothing in your case can stop me until a judge says otherwise." The words were delivered without heat, without mockery, but with a certainty that gnawed at Mark more than open hostility would have. It was as if Jason lived in a world where the verdict was already written, and all of Mark's resistance was a mere formality. The midpoint of the conflict arrived on a gray morning when Claire arranged for an independent assessor to visit the site. The man carried a laser measuring device and a stack of forms, and he moved methodically across the ground, marking coordinates with precision. When he finished, he delivered his conclusion in simple words. The residential structure is 30 feet inside the industrial property. No ambiguity, hearing it aloud, stated with professional detachment, filled Mark with a surge of both relief and terror. Relief because his claim was confirmed. Terror because the simplicity of the truth did not guarantee that it would matter. He had seen how quickly papers could vanish, how easily seals could be forged, how indifferently officials could look past evidence. That evening, he walked the perimeter of his factory, listening to the steady hum of machines inside, and felt the tension of living between two realities. In one, his land was his, safeguarded by deeds and history. In the other, his land was already slipping away, fenced and claimed by a neighbor who wielded loopholes like weapons. He realized then that his struggle was no longer about convincing others of the truth. It was about surviving long enough for the truth to be recognized. The midpoint was not a turning of the tide, but a revelation. He was standing in the center of a storm where the ground itself could be rewritten, and the real battle had only begun. The weeks following the assessor's blunt confirmation were anything but reassuring, because rather than slowing Jason down, the report seemed to provoke him into greater boldness, as if he had anticipated that the measurement would come out against him and had already prepared the next stage of his campaign. The new garage rose quickly, its walls sprouting almost overnight, and soon scaffolding appeared for an extension that leaned toward the factory wall like a growing shadow. Mark protested, filed complaints through Claire, and sent letters to the city inspectors, but the responses were either delayed or perfunctory, as though every office had adopted the same tactic of stalling until fatigue broke him down. Meanwhile, Jason began to cultivate an image of himself as the wronged party, a homeowner supposedly besieged by an industrial neighbor unwilling to accept the limits of his property. Mark learned of this shift not through direct confrontation but through whispers in the neighborhood, where residents repeated versions of the story that made Jason sound like a victim. The escalation reached a new level when one morning Mark arrived to find several official-looking notices plastered to the factory gate. They were printed on municipal letterhead with bold stamps of "Inspection Required," accusing his facility of improper waste disposal and unauthorized storage. Mark knew instantly the accusations were false. His recycling plant had strict protocols and he had never once failed an inspection. But the damage was done. Within days, 2 men in reflective vests arrived with clipboards demanding access under authority of environmental compliance. Mark allowed them in, unwilling to be accused of obstruction, and watched as they moved through the factory with suspiciously little interest in actual operations. They photographed corners of the yard, tapped on containers, and whispered to each other, then departed without leaving a report. Claire later confirmed his suspicion. The men were not listed on the official inspector roster. Whoever they were, they had been sent to create the appearance of scrutiny, to seed doubt in case the dispute spilled into broader public forums. Jason's tactics became more personal as well. Mark noticed that workers returning from shifts described being stopped on the road by strangers asking pointed questions about their employment, their hours, and whether the factory was safe. Some workers laughed it off, others grew uneasy, and few quietly resigned. The factory floor felt thinner each day, the rhythmic sounds of production echoing more hollowly in the cavernous space. Mark tried to fill the gaps himself, working late into the night, but exhaustion made him clumsy, and one evening he burned his hand badly while handling molten glass. As he stood in the infirmary with the smell of scorched skin rising from his palm, he realized that Jason's war was not only about land, but about attrition, about forcing him to collapse under the weight of too many battles at once. The psychological pressure deepened when anonymous letters began arriving at Mark's office. They were typed, unsigned, always brief, containing cryptic lines like, "Factories are temporary," "Homes endure," or "You can't fight history." At first, Mark dismissed them as childish provocations, but the fourth letter contained a photocopy of his father's original deed with sections blacked out, as if someone were rehearsing how to erase his ownership line by line. He showed it to Claire, who frowned and said, "They want you rattled, but don't underestimate them." If someone is capable of falsifying survey markers, they can falsify deeds too. Her warning unsettled him more than the letter itself, because it confirmed what he already feared, that the documents he clung to as anchors could be twisted into weapons against him. In an effort to strike back, Claire filed motions to freeze any construction on the disputed line until the court hearing, but Jason countered with his own filings, claiming that halting his projects would cause irreparable harm to his residents. The legal ping-pong dragged on, but in the physical world, the construction never stopped. By the end of the month, Jason had extended his fencing further, cutting so close to the loading bay that trucks could no longer reverse properly. Deliveries piled up at the front of the factory, and Mark had to rent smaller vehicles to shuttle goods in and out. The costs mounted rapidly, eating into already thin margins. More than once he stared at his balance sheets and wondered whether Jason's true strategy was simply to starve him financially until selling the land felt like the only escape. One evening, exhausted and half delirious from the constant pressure, Mark wandered to the disputed fence line and saw Jason standing there quietly, arms folded, watching the factory lights flicker against the dark. They exchanged no words, but the silence itself was heavier than any argument. In Jason's posture there was no triumph, no mockery, only the stillness of someone who believed he had time on his side, who knew that courts, inspectors, and neighbors would eventually bend to the narrative he had set in motion. Mark turned back toward the factory with the sickening realization that escalation was no longer measured in physical barriers or official documents, but in the slow erosion of his own strength, his workers' loyalty, and his community's perception. The second escalation was not an explosion but a suffocation, a deliberate layering of obstacles, insinuations, and half-legitimate actions that together threatened to choke the life out of everything his father had built. And as he stood in the quiet factory yard, the night air carrying the faint metallic scent of the new fence, Mark knew that if he did not find a way to reverse the tide soon, the battle would end not with a dramatic clash, but with his slow erasure. From the very land he had always believed was his, the day of the hearing arrived with a heaviness that pressed on Mark from the moment he woke, as though even the air in his lungs had thickened, and though he tried to steady himself with the routine of black coffee and the measured walk through the factory floor, he could not shake the sensation that everything rested on a fragile edge that could tilt either toward vindication or absolute ruin. Claire met him at the courthouse, composed and meticulous in her dark suit, her briefcase filled with deeds, surveyor reports, and the archival maps that Leonard had uncovered, each piece of evidence a lifeline knotted together to form a rope, strong. Enough, they hoped, to pull him back from the abyss Jason had opened beneath him. Jason arrived shortly after, calm as always, his beard trimmed, his steps unhurried, accompanied by an attorney who radiated the same collected confidence, and the sight of them together only deepened the dread in Mark's stomach, because it looked less like neighbors in dispute and more like a performance rehearsed long in advance. The proceedings unfolded in the flat, restrained language of law, but beneath the surface every sentence felt like a blade. Claire presented the documents in careful sequence, beginning with the original deed from Mark's father, progressing through the surveys that confirmed the boundaries, and culminating in the faded but decisive municipal notation declaring the house a temporary structure never authorized for permanence. She spoke without hesitation, her voice cutting cleanly through the courtroom's silence, and Mark, watching the judge's expression, dared to believe that reason might still prevail. But Jason's attorney rose with the practiced ease of someone who had dismantled arguments like this many times before. He held up newer documents, glossy and precise, stamped with seals that looked unquestionable, declaring updated boundaries and provisional allowances, and he argued that whatever had happened in the 80s was irrelevant in the face of decades of established residence. His words carried the weight of inevitability, as if the law itself bowed to the passage of time. For hours the battle swung back and forth, Claire hammering at inconsistencies in Jason's maps, pointing out signatures that did not align with official rosters, raising questions about the sudden appearance of provisional documents no one could trace to a proper file. At one point she introduced Leonard's testimony, and the surveyor described in detail how markers had been replaced in recent months, his tone edged with quiet outrage, and the judge leaned forward with interest. Yet, even as the cracks in Jason's position grew visible, he never faltered. He sat calmly, hands folded, his gaze steady, as though the outcome had already been decided beyond the walls of the courtroom. The climax arrived not in a dramatic outburst, but in the judge's deliberate announcement that the evidence of tampered markers and missing archival files demanded serious scrutiny, and therefore the court could not accept Jason's claims of permanency. Entitlement. The room seemed to exhale as the words settled. The house was indeed 30 feet inside Mark's property. The fence and the garage were unlawful encroachments, and immediate cessation of construction was ordered. For a moment Mark felt the dizzying relief of a man who has been drowning and suddenly finds air, the roar of blood in his ears louder than the judge's continued instructions. Jason's attorney objected, tried to press the point of irreparable harm, but the judge cut him off with the firmness of finality. Yet even in victory, Mark sensed the shadow of unease. Jason did not protest, did not rage or argue. He simply nodded once, collected his papers, and walked out of the courtroom as though nothing of consequence had occurred. The calmness chilled Mark more than any anger could have, because it suggested that Jason's war had never been limited to this ruling. As he left the courthouse beside Claire, who assured him that enforcement orders would compel removal of the fence and halt of all further intrusion, Mark looked across the street and saw Jason standing under the branches of a bare tree. His face, unreadable. His stillness once again that of a man who believed time remained his ally. The climax had delivered justice, but justice felt fragile, like a pane of glass balanced on uncertain ground, and Mark understood with grim clarity that the fight for his land was not finished simply because the court had spoken. He had won the decisive battle, but the war of endurance, of perception, of bureaucracy, of unseen hands moving markers and forging documents, still waited beyond the courthouse doors. The weeks after the ruling passed in a blur of enforcement notices and reluctant compliance, and though Mark should have felt triumphant as city crews dismantled the illegal fence and dismantled the half-built garage that had leaned menacingly toward his factory wall, the satisfaction was muted, tempered by the lingering unease of how close he had come to losing everything. Workers returned to the factory with cautious optimism. Deliveries resumed through the restored entrance, and production began to steady. Yet Mark moved through each day with the wary vigilance of someone who had learned how fragile the line between order and chaos could be. The land was his again, not because truth had prevailed on its own, but because he had fought relentlessly, dragging hidden maps and buried rulings into the light, and the cost of that fight showed in the exhaustion etched into his face and the thinness of his finances. Jason vanished from daily view soon after the judgment, his house standing silent, curtains drawn, the yard untended. Neighbors whispered that he had moved out. Others claimed he was waiting for an appeal, but Mark knew better than to believe in ending so clean. One evening, as he locked the factory gates, he noticed an envelope tucked into the hinge, unmarked, containing nothing but a single sheet of paper with the words, "Time is patient," typed across the center. He burned it without showing Claire, unwilling to give the message more life than it already had, but the phrase lingered in his mind, not as a threat but as a reminder that victories in such wars were never absolute. And yet, despite the shadows, there was resilience. Mark began to meet with other factory owners and landholders in the district, sharing his story not as a tale of triumph but as a warning, urging them to safeguard their records, to know their boundaries, to be ready when complacency was exploited. Slowly, a sense of solidarity grew where once there had only been isolation, and, though he remained wary, Mark felt a renewed purpose in transforming his ordeal into something larger than survival. Standing in the yard one late afternoon, watching the glow of the furnaces cast long orange streaks across the concrete, he understood that the factory was no longer only his father's legacy, but a symbol of persistence against forces that thrived on silence and neglect. He had not been erased, and as long as the machines roared and the furnaces burned, his land remained his, marked not by provisional lines or forgotten notations, but by the endurance of his refusal to step aside.